Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to see everyone's faces, and everybody online, thank you for joining us as well. So we're here to talk about a very important and timely topic, UFOs or cybersecurity. Sorry. So we're here to talk about cybersecurity. In all seriousness, a very important topic at the moment. I'm joined by an expert panel here, and thank you, Tim, for agreeing to moderate. But before we get started, I want to kind of just level set on the report itself, which you should see some QR codes around. You should be able to scan those and be able to see it on your phone. It is live at this point, but I just want to kind of go through things as I was asking myself, what would the audience members be asking about the report immediately? So to level set and then get to the experts in the room and what their opinion is of the report. So how do we come up with the members of the working group? Well, we try to tap a diverse and comprehensive cross-section of society and the cybersecurity ecosystem. We focused on representatives that could speak to their sector's concerns as experts with authority. In addition to cyber expertise, we sought individuals that could speak to some of the externalities of cybercrime. So specifically some attorney generals, some folks in the privacy space, to look at what the local impact would be. So this led to the group that you see mostly represented here today, but some folks from the working group that couldn't make it. Again, thank you for your contributions, and thank you all for coming today as well. Was there anything we left out and why? So the list of 8 risks that represent an extensive effort to consolidate from a large group that we kind of brainstormed. So we started with roughly around 122 threats and cybersecurity risks that the collective working group had brainstormed. From there, we consolidated it down to 66, which was still a lot. From there, we then consolidated it down to around 13, 14, and that's when Jamil and I met to kind of interpret some of these risks and threats and come up with a group of 8 that you see today, and then talk to the working group members to make sure that it was in line with their vision of the top risks for this year. It was important that we didn't assign a number, so you might be asking why 8, why not 10 or 15? Because we didn't want to assign an arbitrary number to this. We wanted to make sure that it was no fat on the risks that we recommend as being the top priorities this year. And so that's how we got to the 8. And the other thing that you might be asking yourself is, I don't see this thing that I'm interested in, or why did you leave this out? Well, we did a concerted effort to identify risks for 2023, and I'll give you a quick example for that. Insider threats. We do have some conversations about that in the report, but that's not necessarily specific to 2023. We wanted to try to focus on things there. And please give us the right to be wrong on some of these things, but this was a long effort to try to identify things for this year specifically. And so, just the process, and I'll kick it over to Tim in just a moment, but we met for the last 6 months. And over those 6 months, we met about a collective 4 different times. And throughout the time, it was continuing engagement from the working group members. And like I said, we focused on getting their expertise on the paper as much as possible. So the process was try to draw that out and put it on paper in a concise way. So I want to thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim Starks. I am the author of the Cybersecurity 202 newsletter for the Washington Post. Next to me is Jamil Farshi, Executive Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Equifax. You already met Tom Romanoff, Director of the Technology Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where we are. Then Jerry Davis, founder of GryphonX. Christopher Painter, former cybersecurity leader at the U.S. Department of State, Department of Justice, and the White House. And then Nupur Davis, the Executive Vice President and Chief Information Security and Product Privacy Officer at Comcast. Yeah, it's good. It's the combo. So anytime I read or anytime I see a report like this and think this is interesting, I'd like to report on this, I always ask the people who are involved, what are your main takeaways? And I don't know if this quite applies, but if it does, I'd like each of you to answer all of these questions. Anything that surprised you? So I don't know if we can start with you, Jamil, or just go down the row.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you all for coming today and overcoming the Super Bowl hangover that I think most people have. So the most surprising thing for me is as I went through the list, and we actually had a debate about this in our last group meeting. It's the newness and the novelty of the risks that are identified in the report. And I think if you look through it, I don't know, roughly 85% of the things that are on there aren't novel. They aren't super innovative and bleeding edge kind of things. And so I think the most surprising thing to me is that a lot of the risks that we've highlighted here are the same risks that I think could have been on this list had we done it 5 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago. And so in some ways it's predictable somewhat, but in other ways it's discouraging. It's because we as a community, we as a country, have not advanced the ball effectively enough to be able to mitigate or even draw down some of the risks that we've highlighted in here. I mean, you look at the critical infrastructure, you look at the governance, you look at the vulnerabilities within our environments, and it is disappointing. I think we have a long way to go. So that's probably my number one takeaway from this report.
So I think probably the biggest surprise that I had was, I guess the first thing that I tried to level set is, do we talk about China and Russia and their role in cybersecurity? And by and large, the entire working group said we need to at least address kind of the evolving geopolitical environment that is cybersecurity these days. So it was quite surprising that in my mind, cybersecurity was always a domestic endeavor. That's because, in my experience with cybersecurity, it was potentially working with folks in the federal sector to secure their agencies. But in the evolving world that is cybersecurity, you must take into account these days foreign folks that are trying to tap into our systems. So that was the first kind of wake-up moment when I was putting together this report.
Jerry?
I would say in particular, that I liked what came out of the report was the aspect of, as you have the top level risk, the 8 risks, are the underlying risk factors, which I thought was extremely important. We initially kind of started this effort. One of the things that it became very kind of specific, where you started talking about critical infrastructure. And we quickly realized that that's not going to work, right? So kind of expanding out from there, what the report surprisingly gives is that as you look at the different risks, when you get down into the different risk factors, that is extremely important for the individuals, regardless of what industry you're in, because then you're able to better determine what your real risks are coming out of report. So I think as individuals take a look at the risk factors, there's obviously more risk factors than what we have in the report, but I was generally surprised and really appreciated the work that we got down to understanding the risk factors, the things that lead organizations into a potential risk catastrophe. So I really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah, I don't think anything really particularly surprised me. Certainly didn't surprise me as much as an Eagles fan as the bad call in the last 10 minutes of the game. But I'd say we're in a different time frame now where I think this report is particularly important because of some of the geopolitical events, China and Russia in particular in Ukraine, because of the ransomware sort of pandemic we've seen over the last number of years. There's much more heightened awareness than there has been before. And so calling attention to these risks, I think, is really important, and trying to catalog them is really important. I always say one of the most depressing things you can do is read old national strategies, like from 2003, and see how much is still the same and we haven't done. And so some of these risks are of that character. Some of these are long-term systemic risks. Others are more new risks. But I do think there's more impact now. There's more of an inflection point where there's a chance people are going to do something about them. So identifying them, I think, is important. It was very hard to boil these down. I think we had a very, on the other hand, I had a very international perspective going in and also understand the domestic risks as well. But we're seeing a lot of different things changing, including we talked about regulatory risk, for instance, is one of the things that, whenever the strategy comes out from the US, I think we'll see more of that, for instance. So that struck me. The timing of this, I think, is particularly good, and the follow through of identifying what the risks are and then figuring out what to do about it, I think, is going to have more landing power than it normally would have in the past.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat, but I do agree with the general theme here is that we do see history kind of repeating itself. And if you look at the top categories, you could go back 3 years, and they're pretty similar. One of the games I play is every year I look at the OWASP top 10 risks, right? And it's amazing how much the list hasn't changed in like 20 years, right? Things, and it's similar here. But what I liked about where we ended up is we took kind of the unfortunately evergreen cyber risks and we made them current. How do they play in the immediacy of 2023? And what is going on in 2023 where there is more focus on nation state, there is more focus on cybercrime, especially enabled by cryptocurrencies and other new technologies. There is more focus on the global economic and the local national economic conditions. So it's you take the sort of cyber risks that we always fight against, but then you make them relevant for what's happening this year and the current climate, both global and national. And that's what I liked about where we ended up.
It's almost like you predicted my next question, which was, there's a theme here of a lot of these things being repeats. What feels the most 2023 of some of these risks or risk factors? I don't know if you want to start. You touched on it already, but I don't know if you want to go further and then.
Totally. So I think it's a trifecta. It is the regulatory focus, and it's really interesting. I think the place where we've seen most action in the regulatory area is through the privacy lens. But the privacy lens then, of course, impacts the security lens. So it's that focus from privacy that's also shifting into cyber, and so there's that lens. That's, I think, feels different now than it did 5 years ago. Feels more immediate in 2023. The second is the fact that there is a active conflict in Ukraine and active social unrest in the Middle East, and so there's that nation state. And then the third is the technology. You just can't ignore that. In fact, just in the time that we worked on this report, I think if we were doing it today, we would bring in OpenAI and generative AI into our discussion, right? So, but that focus on cyber, on crypto, on AI, on the changing technology landscape, that is just seeming to focus in a particular area in 2023. So those three areas, I think the regulatory environment influenced by privacy, the current geopolitical issues that are going on, and then the technology that is just.
Before we move to the next person, I want to drill down on one thing you said. Why do you think the privacy issue is different, say, this year than?
Because I think if you just see the number of things that have already taken place, just in the U.S., there are 5 states now that have very definitive regulations, and I think it's on the roster for every state. And there is, of course, national discussion at the national level as well. But if you think, when I talk to our chief privacy officer, right, one of the things she always says is, you can't do privacy without security. So it's that privacy impact that also impacts cyber.
Yeah, and I'd say, I build on that. On the regulatory front, everyone here knows that regulation's sort of been a dirty word on both sides of the aisle for forever. I mean, even the hint of regulation, people would run screaming from the room, and it would just cause, at the same time, we've noticed that incentives have not worked. They're not alone working. Not that incentives are bad, but it hasn't really changed things. And when you're talking about critical infrastructure, it's critical for a reason, right? It's critical because it's critical. We can't supposedly survive without it, or it has a major impact on our lives. So can we continue to take this approach? And the debates often come down to, well, regulation will stop innovation, et cetera, et cetera. But you can do this in a smart way, and I think that's where we're seeing the trend. And also the US has been a bit behind the 8 ball in the sense that while we're doing nothing, Europe and others are, and global companies are governed by global rules. And so, what Europe does have an impact. So I think that's one aspect. And again, I think that's kind of presaging what we'll see in the national strategy from the US, for instance. So I think that's really important, that change of mind saying, well, maybe we do need something, maybe we need to move on. On the geopolitical front, I think the change there that the Ukraine war has illustrated is a lot of people didn't really care about a lot of the geopolitical stuff because, well, it's nation states, they're trying to steal secrets, espionage is espionage, doesn't impact me. Where now what we're seeing, and particularly, it's a result of the Ukraine war, but even before that, is disruptive state attacks. And disruptive state attacks do go to your bottom line. If it's a ransomware group that's being coddled by a state, that goes to business interruption. That has an impact that it didn't before. So I think that geopolitical risk is broader and deeper than I think people recognized before when they were dismissing it as saying, well, states will be states and they're going to play their games, or if my trade secrets get stolen, maybe I won't recognize it for 5 or 10 years, So it's changed, I think, dramatically in that sense as well.
And if anybody else, I can move on to the next question. If anybody wants to weigh in on that also. Okay.
Well, I think there's a ton of them. I mean, the most obvious one to me is the economic headwinds. I mean, I think we're in probably the early innings. Hopefully we're not, but it looks like we're probably in the earlier innings on the economy slowing down. And we've seen just since the year started, I mean, a whole host of organizations having layoffs and the technology front. And then if you look at that, obviously investment is going down. If you look at the startup community, valuations have gone down significantly, and so they've done a lot of belt tightening. And so it puts us in a situation where, look, you've got organizations that are spending less money. Presumably, to some degree, it's going to be less on security as more of a back office function that doesn't drive direct revenue. And then you also have presumably less innovation because of that lower spending level with the security community as well. So I think there's a whole host of things that we've put in there that, while again they're things, whether in terms of governance and things like that, and nation states and so on, that have been historically present. They've been modernized to Newport's point, to 23 specifically. So I want to answer a question I asked myself, which is what surprised me about the report. It was the idea that the regulations would be a risk. I think you used the phrase overlapping, conflicting, subjective. Would anyone like to weigh in on why that is a risk? That was interesting to me, to think of that as a risk per se.
Well, I think it was a debate. So I think some of us there were some conflicting views on that, I think. And so the report illustrates both of those views, that there's risk to it, but it's also something that we thought was beneficial. So we didn't want to come up with any kind of proclamation. I remember we talked about this, that regulation posed a risk writ large, so we didn't want regulation, because I don't think that's the right answer. I think the worry is that if regulation is done in a bad way and it's conflicting, or it has different, Europe has one set of rules, the US has another, and they're not compatible and they're not interoperable, that could be a problem. So I think that's what was being identified there. And I think many of us, the key part of that, though, is you didn't want to communicate that meant regulation itself was bad or you should stay away from it.
Yeah, I think to Chris's point earlier, the incentive model has not proven to be as effective as we would have liked. And so I think there is definitively a need for regulation. For an example of conflicting regulations would be around breach disclosure. Look, there's all kinds of guidance out there right now, whether it's 24 hours, 48, 72 with materiality. And so as someone on the front lines defending an organization, you wonder, well, wait a minute, which one do I comply with? Do I just go to the least common denominator? And then you say, well, 24 hours, I don't really know much at that point. So what exactly am I even gonna talk about? And then you go even a step further and say, well, what exactly is an incident anyway. I'm still looking for a definition on that front. So I think we just need more clarity to be able to effectively execute toward the requirements that are out there.
Yeah, I'll build on both of those. I think the risk is from just too many and not always consistent. Because then what ends up happening is you spend your resources in addressing those instead of really focusing on, as a front line, defending your companies, your infrastructure, and so on, and your customers and your employees. The other issue is clarity. When something as simple as, report an incident within 72 hours comes up, to Jamil's point, is, the questions that go through your head is 72 hours from when? Because the way cyber really works is, the time of occurrence and the time of discovery and the time to where you go, oh, this is material. Those can be long periods between those times. And so when does the clock start? What do you report? Who do you report it to? How are you sure that you're doing it in a safe and secure way? How do you make sure that what all of us are reporting comes back as a benefit? So again, there's need. I think there's good benefit for reporting, especially if you get back the combined intelligence. But there's just clarity and focus that is needed so that we can comply and respond and do it in the right way.
And I would also finally add that, and it's not just at the national level, at the federal level. There's reporting requirements at the local level, at the state level, particularly if you're in an environment that's a regulated environment like utilities, right? So, me being in the state of California, they have certain reporting requirements as well to places like the California Public Utilities Commission. So there's all these kind of dynamics and conflicts that are going on that really elevates kind of the risk profile. And organizations don't want to be on the bad side of reporting. So you're trying to deconflict all of these reporting requirements, and it does drive a certain level of risk into the environment.
Yeah, I think when I think of the word risk, I think of potential for harm. And I think that's what I was struggling with, was like, what is the potential for harm? I feel like you've touched on it.
Yeah, well, every minute that we spend trying to deconflict is a minute that we're not spending actually defending and responding to the threat.
Yeah. There were some questions that people submitted online in advance. This is my favorite, I think. This is from Ron Mitchell. What are the things that an individual can do to counter these risks?
I can start. It's a simple set of rules, I think. You have to be careful. And what does that mean? Be aware of social engineering, which still continues to be the number one way that even for enterprises that the threat actors gain access. So just learn about things like phishing and vishing and smishing and all kinds of social engineering that happens. Have strong passwords. Use multi-factor authentication wherever you can. Don't get on any public Wi-Fi. Even if it says I'm very safe, connect to me. It probably isn't. So just those basic things. Hygiene. Just learn about the impacts of social engineering. Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication wherever you can do it. Make sure that you are not joining unsafe and insecure Wi-Fi to do your high-level security business. So simple things, but they're not easy. Simple doesn't mean easy.
It feels like a lot of people that I talk to about multi-factor authentication, they feel harassed by it.
It's not, you have to make that, I wish it was seamless, but security often is that balance between usability and security. And MFA can feel like it's getting in your way. It's getting better and better and better, especially on devices. So when you become your factor, so when your biometrics become your factor, it's easy then, right? It's your thumbprint or your face or your voice. But without that, yes, it can seem intrusive.
I think people have to understand the value of this too. And there are limitations. Even people who are security professionals, don't often have all the security habits they should. I mean, it's a sad reality because we're human. And so I think, or most of us are human. So I think that one of the challenges is, in the long term, how do you also move this up the stack? How do you make it so that people don't have to worry about that? There's an economic dimension of that. There's other dimensions of it. In the past, people have not valued security enough to actually pay more for it. At least in the U.S., in some countries they do. But how can that start being built into the infrastructure more generally, so that the ordinary grandmother doesn't have to worry about it, because that's not going to be sustainable in the long term.
One of the risks that you identify in the report is talent scarcity and the lack of cyber professionals to the level that organizations feel like they need it. We've seen pretty massive layoffs in the tech sector. Does that impact this at all? Do things like AI automation potentially help with that as well? What do those factors play in solving that crisis?
So far, it hasn't. The layoffs haven't really provided any relief on the talent front within security. I think the last number I saw, there's still 700,000 open security jobs in the U.S. alone. So that hasn't actually borne out yet. AI potentially could provide some relief, I think. It's got potential, but it's too early to meaningfully be able to tell if that's gonna play out. I think what we need, it's more systemic. Like we need to have more focus and more investment in building up that broader pipeline. We just aren't getting enough kids in school being educated on cyber, so that when they get out, it's easy to be able to tap into them. I also think that organizationally within our industry, we've historically had a reticence to bring in people who don't explicitly have cyber expertise. And I think we need to be able to broaden that horizon, because there's a ton of skill sets, a ton of them, don't even have to be technical, that could be brought into security. You could teach them the security components and they can be extraordinarily valuable. But to date, there's been too much of a reticence to be able to adopt that approach.
Yeah, I don't think it's plug and play. I don't think simply because you know something about computers. So some of the people being laid off have not been trained on security. So it's not, and unfortunately, a lot of the people, for some organizations, some of the people who got laid off were the security people. So that makes it even worse. So it is getting more people interested in this. It's building that pipeline and maybe retraining some of the people who have been laid off to do this. I mean, they do have some basic understanding of tech, but they have to understand the security element, which is a different field, frankly.
Yeah, exactly what Chris said about repurposing some of the talent that you have inside of organizations. I see as a big push. There is, we saw this big kind of chasm of a deficit in security professionals a number of years ago. And I remember doing a presentation, I think it was like 2014 or something like that, on this. Cisco had come out with some reporting and said that we're going to have this big chasm, a big gap of security professionals by this time, and it has rang true. So some of the things that organizations can do, some of the things that I have done is repurpose skill sets internal to the organization, and externally looking at individuals that have a propensity to learn about security. You don't need to have exactly those tech skills, those hard skills. I think we need to continue to build those, but for me, it's like, are they curious? Can they learn? And there's many aspects of security, whether you're on the risk management side, whether you're on the technology side or strategy side. I believe that the talent is out there. We just have to look at new ways of identifying the talents, and not just by their backgrounds, whether they have a degree in IT or coding and that sort of thing. There are other markers that show that someone can learn and be very good in the security field. I will say that in previous organizations, some of the best security professionals that I had worked with had backgrounds in music, which I thought was really, really interesting. Music, there's something about music and math and patterns and that sort of thing that kind of come together. So I think as hiring managers and organizations look for that talent, you have to look for things like that outside of kind of traditional backgrounds, and that will help fill some of that gap going forward.
Can I jump in? I also want to mention that some of the working group members represented state and small companies as well. And so as much as the talent scarcity has led to a huge demand in workers in the cybersecurity field, just imagine that 10 times or 30 times for state-level cybersecurity entities or small companies that are trying to protect maybe a treasure trove of personal data that's out there. And so I think it's important to also look at the pipeline, like these folks had mentioned, and I agree with everything they were saying, and add a substantial demand level for state-level folks and small companies as well who are struggling to protect their assets there. The other thing I want to mention is, and I think you hit on it, is the diversity needed in order to really meet the entire vector of cybersecurity threats. So if you have a pipeline like a AmeriCorps for cybersecurity, they're trained in a certain way, and you don't know what you don't know. So being able to pull from a diverse set will help you protect against a much wider threat vector.
I know you were careful not to prescribe specific solutions for some of these issues. The one that I wanted to ask about potential solutions for, you have to advocate for whatever ones you want or don't, but it's under the other notable risks, the lack of a defined standard of care. I've always been fascinated by this, and I don't know if there's any way to solve that issue other than just letting it play out in courts until it's just known. Like, I don't know if someone would want to take that and define what that means, that terminology, and talk about potential solutions.
So I'm a recovering lawyer, so I'll start. This has been a big problem. I mean, if you think about when insurance came down the pike, everyone thought, oh, cyber insurance is going to create incentives, it's going to cure all the world's ills, we'll finally get cyber hygiene. Hasn't happened. Now, underwriting standards are getting better now, it's changing, partly because of the ransomware payouts. But if you don't have a standard of care, one of the things you don't have is you don't have liability. You don't, despite being a very litigious society, and there are plenty of lawyers out there, they're really, for bad cyber hygiene, even if it's hurting someone else, because your system is used to pass through, those kind of suits have not been successful. Software liability, a whole range of things haven't happened because there's not a set standard of care. How do you get a set standard of care? Well, I think we're already moving down this path. Even things like that were not designed to do that, like the NIST cybersecurity framework and other things, set sort of de facto standards of care over time. It's just taken an awfully long time. We've been talking about this for 25 years now, and we still haven't gotten there. So I do think we're moving toward it. And it's not just for liability purposes. It also gives a much better sense for industry and others what standard they should be moving up to. Part of that's going to be prescriptive standards, I think the regulatory front, where you have actual standards being set either in the EU or here or somewhere else for critical infrastructure that sets a standard of care for the industry. I think you're going to see this, of course I said this 10 years ago, but I'll say this again, I think you're going to see this over the next couple of years accelerate, and I think that's going to be a good thing across the board.
So I'll combine two questions that we got in advance, and then I'll turn to a question from YouTube in 1 second. But cyber insurance, you had just mentioned it. There were two questions. I'll combine them from Thompson Boyd and Melissa Lawrence. First, how valuable is cyber insurance? And then, how are rates and coverage projected to change over the next, say, 24 months?
I think it's extraordinarily important to have cyber insurance. I mean, it gives you at least some modicum of a backstop. The standards have become far more rigorous than they were in the past. Just in the last couple of years, quite frankly, premiums have gone up and coverage levels have gone down in concert with that, which has been challenging. The thing that worries me the most is that for large companies, look, we're going to get through that and we'll be able to get our coverage because we have the investments and the resources to be able to ensure that we're meeting that sort of reasonable security standard. What worries me, though, are the small to medium-sized businesses. And what I've learned over time is that while I think a lot of folks used to think that small to medium-sized businesses would get cyber insurance just as a pure risk transfer mechanism. They're like, well, I'm not going to invest anything in security, and I'll just get this policy, and it'll cover me if something bad happens. What I think we've learned is that these small to medium-sized businesses actually rely on that cyber insurance because of the breach coaches, because of the expertise that comes along with it, to be able to help them navigate out of those situations when they occur. And we've seen a whole host of organizations end up just going under because they did not have the ability to be able to effectively respond. And remember, these are small businesses. They don't have the resources that the larger organizations do. So I worry as the insurance market evolves, the premiums and the coverage levels are getting such that it's very, very difficult. And at some point, it's gonna meaningfully affect those small and medium-sized businesses.
I would say also that some companies I've come across that's a little bit alarming is that they tend to look at, and this is not everyone, but again, some ones I've come across, they look at cyber insurance as kind of a panacea, kind of fix everything. We'll go through and have the discussions about risk and what their exposures are. And I'll have leaders in organizations say, well, we have cyber insurance. I'm like, well, yeah, that's good, but it's not everything that you need. I think the other piece of that is there's still a little bit of conflict within the insurance communities. And this could be, the same company where there is a conflict between who pays out on your insurance policy. So an example would be, let's say that you were hit with a particular type of malware and it bricked your system, physically damaged your system. Well, is that cyber side of it, or is it property insurance that's going to pay for it? And I've seen those conflicts go back and forth where it's been in a long term, almost in perpetuity, where internal to an insurance company are trying to decide who's paying for it at the end of the day. And so companies are just kind of at the whim of the insurance and what's in the actual policy on getting reimbursed for that. So there's little things like that, little nuances that are still out there that need to be deconflicted. But the insurance policies, I think, are absolutely important as part of a overall cyber strategy. But to Jamil's point, the premiums are going through the roof and the coverage is getting thinner and thinner. So,
and that doesn't even discuss the exclusions that they've now started to put in.
That's what I was going to hit on, because I think I'm happy that the underwriting standards are getting tougher, because that was the problem before. It was a loss leader before. Now, if it's really tied to what a company or insured person is doing, that helps raise the bar. So that could be good, with the caveats that you mentioned about people not being able to afford coverage. I'm worried about statements that have come out of the insurance industry. I understand why they're there, saying, we're going to exclude, or to some extent, we're going to exclude nation-state conduct, based on the kind of active war thing that is in traditional policies. Well, you don't know usually, So if I'm an insured and there's a big ransomware incident, for instance, and maybe it's a group in Russia and Russia is behind it. Maybe they're not. Maybe it becomes, I have no way of predicting that. I'm just trying to insure myself from all the harms that are out there. So that's going to be tough to navigate, I think.
I don't know if you guys ever read YouTube comments. They're usually not productive, but we have a good question here. Going to the practical side of some of this, what is the advice you provide to other levels of business, like the entrepreneurs and small mom and pop shops, on cyber hygiene to avoid the human factor, like human errors?
When we invest in a company, or we are starting a new line of business or expanding, one thing is super, super important is to just start building security in. If you are, as you're coding, as you're designing, as you're thinking about how are you going to operate what you're building, if you just start thinking about those basic things right from the beginning, it is just so much easier than just trying to bolt it on at the end. So that would be, I think, the biggest advice is to think about it as part of, when somebody builds something new or innovates, they think about things like, it's response time, or it's, will the users like it? How am I going to do my A/B testing? How am I going to deploy it? What is my quality of what acceptable levels of quality before I release it, right? They do alpha and beta and all of that. I think part of that whole equation should be security and privacy, both. Is how do you think about that as you're building the products.
So I'm on the board of the Center for Net Security, which is a nonprofit that puts out the CIS controls, and they're fairly detailed, but organizations, if they follow these basic cyber hygiene models, can get rid of a lot of the problems they're having. And you need people to help interpret it and implement those. It's not like an ordinary person off the street can't do it, but I think that would help.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's this notion that cybersecurity is super complex, and it's, oh my gosh. And it is complex, and there's a ton of controls and tools and stuff you can bring to bear. But the reality is the vast majority of incidents that we see are tied back to a handful of controls. I mean, if you do basic things like implement multi-factor authentication, if you patch your systems, if you test your systems from a reliability standpoint so that you actually can test your backups and make sure that your systems are going to come back up. If you do some of these very basic things, you're largely going to be able to sleep at night and avoid some catastrophe. The problem is that we end up looking, and maybe it's just by design and we self-selected to this space because we love technology and everything else. We always look for these technology silver bullets, and we overinvest in all these random things. When if we just focus on these core fundamental things, then we're going to be far better off. And I think that's what we miss a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in, for the mom and pop and the small business folks, I'm sure the working group members and people in the audience have been selected by extended family to be their representative cybersecurity expert of some sort, and we've all had to be on the phone. My mother is almost 90, and I've been on the phone with her for hours. And so having somebody that can speak to that, they're lucky because this is what I self-selected into. But I think for a lot of folks that are, trying to run these businesses, or elderly folks that are being targeted by cyber criminals, they don't have that person. And so I think organizations like Chris has mentioned, it's critically important, and it's not as complicated as I think the media puts it out to be. So it's important to digest it, or at least have unlucky or lucky in this case, son-in-law that can digest it for you.
At Dastardly Media.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the big areas that I see, that especially some of the smaller businesses that they struggle with, is that if they're lucky enough to bring in a professional to kind of help them understand their environment and what they need to do, yes, the basic hygiene controls are out there. They can go and find those. There's a plethora of them. There's lots of places you can get those from. But when you bring in a professional consulting organization or a consultant, a lot of times that organization is hit with sticker shock, right? They get the sticker shock. They're like, you need all this stuff. And what I've tried to do with customers is help them understand how to prioritize and slope that cost over time. You don't have to do everything at once. We talk about defense in depth and all these layers of controls. You don't have to have all this. If you do the basics, and as you get more sophisticated over time, you can add additional technology and processes, but the cost of that should be sloped over time. And I try to help organizations understand what to prioritize and how to slope that cost over time. It's extremely helpful to organizations, I found.
All right, we've got some Q&A period, and someone will be bringing a mic to you. We have one hand up over here. If you could do me the kindest favor of actually having a question rather than a lecture, that'd be great.
I would never lecture.
No, I know you would.
So this might be too niche, but it's worth a shot. I'm looking into how US Cyber Command is using AI to deal with the talent shortage. And, it's come up that this is a great idea on the one hand, but the stakes are so high. Can we trust AI to do some of that data crunching that's feeding into what the actual people dealing with adversaries and looking for indicators are doing? And I'm wondering if anyone has a take on the limits of AI in that kind of environment. And again, I know it's a little niche, so if you don't know, don't worry.
So I'd say that the danger is if you're using AI to fully automate, cyber offensive operations, because there does need to be a human element in that, in my view, for lots of reasons, for geopolitical and other reasons and sensitive reasons. I think AI is a valuable tool to get the underlying data, but like anything else, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you have to have the right data feeding that AI to actually get you reliable results in anything, and we've seen this with big data more generally. And AI is a tool that's being used increasingly by big cybersecurity companies, but it's also being used by cyber criminals more too. So it's not a panacea. It's going to fix everything. And as you said, AI is often a marketing term now more than necessarily reality. But I think, look, I think when you have massive amounts of data, I think any organization is going to use them. And the question is how reliable is the underlying data?
Well, I think Chris.
It's,
Sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. The ML part of AI, the machine learning, the behavior baselining, the anomaly detection, that part is, I think, amazingly effective. And again, if you have the data and the data are right and usable, it's tremendously useful. We use it to a very, very large degree, and we are using it more and more and more each year and getting better and better at it. So, but the true AI part, I'm not sure about. More ML, yeah.
But I think that's the thing, is that a lot of people hear the word AI, and you're all using Chat GPT nowadays, and people get scared of it, or they think, oh my gosh. I think it's just like anything else. First off, we use a lot of AI in our security tools today, as it stands. Now, not a whole lot of the natural language component, which is sort of the new novel area in that space. But there's absolutely no reason in my mind to think that you shouldn't use these, at least as a supplement to what we're doing today. If anyone's suggesting, hey, I'm going to nuke my entire team and just use AI for this, probably I would advise against that. But to use it as a component of your defense, I think that's smart, and we should.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another tool, right? It's another tool in the tool bag. AI combined with obviously the components of machine learning and ML is extremely effective at pattern matching, right? So large data sets, AI is extremely essential to that, but you still need a human in the loop to kind of even determine what are you looking for, like what are the patterns that you're looking for to, what do you want to pull out? There's somewhere in all this data, I like to say there's a pony in there somewhere, and AI is very effective again at looking at pattern matching, determining patterns, and to help you get to an end. But it's a tool, right? And it's not fully there. And again, I agree 100% with Jamel. Wouldn't nuke the team in favor of an AI solution.
I did not have the word pony on my bingo card for today's session.
And who doesn't want a pony?
Other questions from the audience? Up here? Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I think you guys touched on this a little bit before when talking about two-factor authentication. I think the average person doesn't really want to do that or even realize the risks at a personal level they can face. How do you make, for lack of a better word, how do you make cybersecurity on a personal level sexy for the average person?
Well, if you've ever been a victim of it, then it becomes sexy real fast, I think. Look, I think it's just about looking at the implications ultimately. And I think Chris mentioned this earlier, all the security people use all of the tools and stuff and the right behaviors. Even I don't use MFA on every single service that I've signed up for, but I do use it for the ones that are critical. And it's the same sort of philosophy that we as security folks should use for our organizations, which is, hey, figure out what the keys to the kingdom are, figure out what the most important assets are, and then try to put the appropriate level of protections around those while allowing some level of freedom elsewhere. And I think the same thing applies to the everyday American, which is, hey, understand that you don't necessarily need to use this across the board, but where stuff matters, your financial accounts or whatever, then you're going to have to implement this stuff. And if you don't, and I see this all the time, where individuals just run awry of this, and then once they feel the pain of an incident, whether it's a local ransomware, one of my neighbors last year, she's like 85. She was a victim of a ransomware attack. And what she was worried about is that she had all of her kids' photos on her computer, like all of her grandkids and stuff. And ultimately, they were asking for it was like a $2,000 ransom, which is pretty pricey, I thought, for an individual. But she ended up losing all of this data because the decryptor didn't end up working that she ended up having to pay for, and she lost it all. And that's all these memories that she won't be able to recapture again. And so she got religion pretty quick after that occurred. But the unfortunate thing, and you see this at companies as well, which is unless you feel that pain, unless you go through that experience, oftentimes it's difficult to be able to sort of pierce that the bias against inaction.
Sometimes I think we need like a Smokey the Bear kind of campaign, which is just persistent, long-term, in small bites. It's sort of hard because most cyber incidents, as opposed to fires that impact, a lot of people, and but most cyber incidents are personal, and so you kind of always go, it's not going to happen to me, and that kind of campaign that is persistent and long and really talks about that, yes, it's individual, but it's enough individuals that it's a societal issue, is probably what's going to make people go, yes, I'll put up with a little bit of pain, or I understand why I need to put up with a little bit of pain.
I will say we talked about having a Smokey the Bear campaign in 2009 in the White House, and so it's been. We talked about. We wish we had it, and to the extent it's been flooded into popular culture, it's really unrealistic. Some of the we haven't succeeded in making that a current thing, sadly.
It's interesting. We've seen CISA of late try to really market these messages to people. Like, I think it's more than a password is what they had for two-factor authentication, and they're trying to. It's a little cheesy and corny that they're using a Boston song, but it's a very valuable thing, I think, that everybody agrees. And I don't know how you solve that issue other than you invest a lot of money in it. How do you get to that problem? I know you've struggled with it. How do you do that?
I mean, I go back to thinking you have to, make it transparent to make it easier on the end user, whether it's by biometrics, whether it's by building in things at the the service level. I don't know, but I just don't.
I think it's both, though. I think we, without a doubt, have to make security is like there's so much friction and it's so complicated and way more than it probably should be. But I think we do need to make an investment. We need to have public service announcements like Smokey the Bear or Got Milk for cybersecurity or whatever it is to get it embedded in the public conscience. And I don't know whether it's in a Super Bowl ad or whatever it might be. I'm not a marketing person, but we need to be able to have that. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to see the same cycle repeat itself.
Yeah, especially because what some estimates will say 80 to 90% of all things that happen in cyber that are bad are because of these user errors. Sorry, you were about to say something, Jerry.
Yeah, I was just saying that you have to drive it into the public, and I like the idea of kind of national ads because that's the world that we live in today, right? Your world is driven today by hardware, software, and persistent connectedness. That's the world we live in. I don't care if you're in a car, if you're in an airplane, on a boat, at home. It's all hardware, software, and persistent connectedness. And so people need to understand what the negative sides of that and how to defend themselves in this world that we live in. We live in this digital world where the internet was not designed with security in mind. It assumed that the endpoints were secure. But now I don't think at the advent of the internet, when it was ARPANET in the 70s, I don't think they expected billions of people to be using this medium and what it is today. So we have to educate, and I think CISA is really trying, but I think it needs to even go broader than that. We have to educate the communities at large. We need to educate the nation at large, individuals, that this is the world you live in. There are bad people out there, and here are some of the things that you need to do to mitigate and survive in this world.
I think in the meantime, though, organizations are playing a decent part in this, which is every time we do a training campaign for our workforce, they're learning more about the threats. They're learning what the right behaviors are, how to identify a URL that's potentially fishy or whatever. And so at least there is some level of improvement on that front. But we need to do more.
Can I just jump in? I don't want to speak for Phil Venables, who was also on the working group, but he says this much more eloquently than I will. And that is, you have to bake in security when you're actually doing the user experience. In terms of trying to create that sexiness, it is always kind of cybersecurity is seen as an add-on. But Phil and some of the panelists have mentioned that it needs to be baked in from the get-go as part of the user experience moving forward.
Any other audience questions? I think we have time for one more back there.
Hi. It seems that nowadays more and more organizations and entities are moving towards cloud computing, especially the Pentagon recently with the Joint Warfare Cloud Computing Contract. What are some of the roles and responsibilities for this innovation and technology, and do you recommend it?
I can start. I think it's as with any new technology, right? There are pros and cons. I think there are a lot of pros in this space. There are a few cons that can really, really get you. So what you have to understand as you get into the cloud is what most cloud providers call the shared responsibility model for security, right? And there is if you think about it as a stack of services, right, all from the physical layer to the application layer, there are some set of services that the cloud provider secures, and then there's some set of services that you, as a user of the cloud, have to secure. And the confusion happens when that is not very clear. When the user assumes that the provider is just securing everything, just because you move to a cloud, you're secure. So recognizing that and then designing a strategy that will make sure that you're, and whenever there are layers, like, okay, I'm going to provide security till here, and then above that is your responsibility. It's that interface, that boundary where most of the issues arise, right? So understanding those different categories and then understanding where that boundary is and how do you address those at all three levels. And I think if you do that, you get so much more homogeneous way of dealing with a set of issues when you go to the cloud than you do when you're sort of doing it on your own. So I'm all for it, but you have to be careful.
Her last point is critical. Complexity is the arch nemesis of security. And what the cloud provides is that homogeneous approach, that standardization. We've been, in my company, we've been undergoing a cloud transformation for the last 5 years, going from full legacy, like on-prem, purely to the cloud. And the capabilities that we now have, purely that are supported by the cloud, that I could not do on-prem, provide me so much more confidence in our security posture, and it simplifies things. Now, to her point, you've got to have the right skill sets to be able to make sure you're making the right configuration decisions at the layer that you control. Because if you mess that up, then all bets are off. But if done correctly, it provides a substantial improvement, in my opinion, of your security posture.
So we have to wrap up with this question. Sorry, very last sort of closing note, going to the practicality of what you can do with this. What do you hope people will do with this report? What would you like Congress to do with it? And how are your organizations going to use it? I hope each of you can address at least some of those questions.
What's that?
Start. Okay, let me jump in. There's a piece of the report that I always come back to that I look in very deeply at that I hope people really, that resonates with the organizations that look at this. And that's when we talk about 2023 and the different threats and the risks that are out there, there's a piece that should resonate with everybody, and that is the aspect of resiliency, right? You're going to get had at some point. And organizations that will survive getting had are organizations that are resilient. So I tell organizations, we got to do the basics and the defensive measures and that sort of thing, but you have to learn to be resilient, right? So I always say that in the security world, it's a boxing match, right? I said, you're getting in a ring, you're going to take some shots, you're going to get hit, you might get knocked down. How long you stay down is a part of that resiliency piece. How quickly can you get up and resume your business functions, especially with things like ransomware and things that we're seeing that's going on, like in the Ukraine, those coming hitting here in the West. Resiliency is a big piece of that. So I would hope that from this report, individuals will take a look at that in particular and understand and learn how to be that they need to be resilient in 2023 and beyond.
So I think that the report's written in such a way that it's not, you don't need to be a coder to understand it, right? And that's deliberate. And so I think it is, I think Congress, people in Congress can look at this, people in the C-suite of companies can look at this, and it can help inform their decisions in a broader sense. I mean, it doesn't prescribe solutions, but a core part that I found is that a lot of people just aren't even aware of the risks are. So this calls out certain things in plain English that they can understand. That's helpful. And then, on a global level too, I think it helps inform the debate. One of the things I do is I run something called the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. It's a worldwide capacity building organization with lots of countries and companies and others that are members of it. This kind of helps inform that work as well. So I think it has multiple audiences, and I think it's valuable because it's written at more understandable levels.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ways I think it's going to be useful internally to us is exactly that. It kind of summarizes, and I'm hoping that our leaders and our people see themselves in that report, but then also go, oh my gosh, there's another bit that is sort of new because, it may not apply to us today, may not apply to us directly, but we better be thinking about it. So that's my hope.
Yeah, I would say one, education, because it is written in a consumable way. That's one. I think that's honestly one of the biggest challenges that we have in security nowadays. Two is as a strategic pressure test. I mean, you can look through that list, and it's very comprehensive. So depending on what strategy you've employed, you can at least use that to be able to sort of balance it out and say, hey, look, did I miss something? Should I have prioritized something greater or not? And then I think the third one would be my hope, my dream, is that we could take these risks into account and start to actually drive solutions for them on a macro sort of systemic level. As I said from the top, a lot of these things in here are not net new things. They aren't super huge surprises, yet we still have not been able to move the ball on those. So my hope from a legislative standpoint, from a corporate governance standpoint, from an investment one, we can read this, take it to heart, and actually start driving some action to put us in a better position.
For me, it creates a vision, and I think in every organization there needs to be two strong leaders, a visionary and a manager. And I think in the cybersecurity space, there's so much need to respond to threats on a daily basis that you start getting into a managerial mindset and you lose the vision over time. So what I hope this report does is create a vision for 2023 that is at the level that can translate across the sectors that we have. We worked very hard not to have solutions put into the report, and that was done intentionally because folks that are a lot smarter than myself will have some of the solutions available or start to think about the solutions for some of these risks. That's for other folks to start thinking about. As long as you maintain the vision and are able to communicate it in a way that gets across different stakeholder groups, that's what's important. And it's also important to think about it on a yearly basis. So this year's risk may not be next year's risk, but if we maintain a vision at that level, it creates a framework for managing some of the threats down the line.
All right. Well, let's end there. Thanks everybody for being in attendance online and in person. Thanks to the panelists. Everybody have a good day.